Okay, it's recording. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Primer Encuentro Relief. We are honored and glad to present Dr. Hagit Borer, professor at the Queen Mary University of London. Dr. Borer is a prominent figure in the formal linguistics field. She carries on her research work on morphosyntax, language acquisitions, and syntax and semantics interface. Some of her most important publications are in the 3 volumes of Structuring Sense. So thank you, Hagit, for giving your insights about linguistics.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
We'll start with the questions that you've already sent us. I think that we can start with the first one, that is, which topics do you consider should be investigated in the next 10 years in the area?
Okay. Actually, why won't you start with the second question? Because the second question has to do with what's already happened, and what will happen presumably will be some kind of a continuation of what had happened.
Which are the great milestones in the discipline in the last 20 years?
Okay. So I think that the linguistics, I mean, I've been in linguistics for a very, very long time now, it seems. It doesn't seem like it's been so long when I think about it from my perspective, but when I look at what's happened in the field and the years that's gone by, it's been a very long time. And when I first became a linguist, I didn't perceive myself as joining linguistics when it was a young field, but in retrospect, it was at the time a much younger field, and we certainly knew a lot less. We now know a lot more. And so the question is, what is the particular path that we went through in the past, whatever, several decades, so that we got to a point where today I think we know more, and it's this particular incremental knowledge that's going to be the foundation of whatever I think would, in my opinion, would need to be done next. I would say that the most important thing that has happened when you look at the overall picture is that the typological thing. And that is the fact that when you look at when I first started doing linguistics, almost all studies focused on English, and studies that were done already, that existed already at the time, and there weren't very many of other languages where we're not given the kind of centrality that they deserve. And that started changing. That started changing in the 80s, and that really gathered momentum. First, it started when we brought on board especially other European languages, and so that would be Romance languages and Germanic languages. These were the first really to be brought on, and gradually other languages got brought on, especially East Asian languages like Japanese and Chinese. And when you're looking at the last 20 years in particular, we are seeing going into a lot of languages which it's not that linguists weren't concerned about these languages before, but they weren't really a core part of the generative tradition. So you're looking at what sometimes is called unfamiliar languages, or you're talking about languages that are sometimes spoken by very small communities that are sometimes a lot of these languages don't have a written tradition. And so these are studies that also involve extensive field work and so on. And there is an important question, I think, that needs to be addressed about why you might say it took so long. Well, actually, it didn't really take that long when you're looking at the overall scheme of things, but it still took a while. So when you're looking at a person like me, when I started doing work on my own native language, this was exotic. This was, I mean, now it's not exotic at all, because there are lots of people who are working on Hebrew and it's not exotic. But at the time it was exotic. It was marginalized. David Pisetsky, who was at MIT more or less at the same time that I was, he was talking on Russian. That was exotic. That was not really part of the central tradition. And I think that the reason is you could be less generous and think that the focus was on English because English has whatever sociological status it has, but I think it really goes beyond that. Genetic grammar started with English. This was to some extent, because I mean, it started where it started, but I think it had the kind of impact that it did was because it happened in the United States, and the United States is very prominent in terms of influence that it has. And so the initial work and the initial modeling was done in English, and it took substantial amount of time for the theory to acquire the tools that made it possible to extend it to other languages. So when you look, for instance, at the first 20 years of linguistics, we were working with tools that were not, they were no good. They were no good for being extended to other languages, except as very, very descriptive tools. And it's only when the theory has reached a certain level of abstraction that allowed us to, the principles and parameters model, basically, that allows us to state principles that we could start to see the degree to which they may be applicable to other grammars, really. And so this is you might think about this as growing pains. You know, you need to sort of get your bearing on one system, which happened to be in English, and then you can start branching out. And I think one of the important things is when you look, for instance, it's been noted, but maybe not sufficiently. So when you look, for instance, at the government and binding period, which would be the 80s and maybe 90s, and which is the beginning of this big typological branching out. And the government and binding model pretty much took on a lot of results that came from relational grammar. And relational grammar did, which is basically a generative framework, it's just sort of a bit of an offshoot. They did do some typological work, especially on European languages as well, but they did do some typological work early on. And the minute that let's say the what sometimes is called the extended standard theory, the minute that it had acquired the tools that it could actually generalize, it immediately took on board a lot of the, certainly a lot of the results of relational grammar, but also somewhat cast formally in different ways, but also a lot of the theoretical insights and the theoretical intuitions that were guiding the relational grammar literature, and kind of integrated it and moved on with it. And this has become extremely important. It's become so important that, in fact, there is, to my mind, since you asked me about challenges and so on, it's become so important and so central that it's coming with a little bit of a danger. And that is that we do want to make sure we are not actually veering back into a descriptive, just using our theoretical tools as descriptive mechanisms for describing languages that we are encountering for the first time and that look different from languages that are better studied. And it is very, very kind of crucial, I think, for us as a field to always remember that the aim is to characterize the human linguistic capacity. It is not to describe a particular instantiation of it, because every given language is a particular instantiation of it, and looking into it, without looking into it, we're not going to be able to proceed with the bigger picture. But when we look at it, we have to remember that the agenda is not to try to be different. The agenda is to try to bring it all together under some kind of a broader approach. And so when you look at a language that hasn't been studied, I think the task is really, first of all, of course, to give it a description, but to also see the extent to which it tells us that our modeling needs to be stretched, needs to be narrowed, needs to be accommodated. So every new grammar that we look at, I mean, if it just falls out, it falls out, that's great. But if it doesn't fall out, it's like a new empirical finding that the empirical finding is at a higher order because we have a full description and the description is theoretical. But it's it requires for us to take a hard look at our model and consider the extent to which we may need to change our thinking so that we could accommodate things that we previously didn't know about or didn't understand or didn't look at or whatever, and now they seem to be out there, and we have to accommodate them. So I think that's the biggest thing that has happened, and I think this will continue to happen, and I think it's a very, very good thing. And we just have to stay a little bit alert that we are not going to be losing the scope of what we're after. The other things that I think that have happened in the last 20 years that are really important is that I think syntax has come a very long way in terms of the particular formal tools that we've been using, and that's come a long way, first of all, because we have more knowledge, but it also come a long way quite simply because of numerical reasons. When I first started being a linguist, or when this was a young field, we were talking about several hundred people, and now you're talking about, you know, a lot more people. And so there's just a lot more, knowledge. There's a lot more knowledge. And so there's been a lot of progress and a lot of progress in our understanding of how syntax works. But at least in my mind, we've reached a point, and we've reached it maybe 20 years ago, since you asked about 20 years. I think we've reached a point in syntax where we are not, it is quite possible, and I think maybe we reached it already in the government and binding period, but certainly later on. We've reached a point where we do not have the syntax internal tools to be able to compare two models, both of which seem to be equally descriptively adequate. Okay, so there are a number of competing explanations there for a variety of things, and also a variety of competing models. I mean, they're not full-fledged models. So if you look, for instance, at anti-symmetry, and you compare it with more, let's say, Chomsky style minimalism, there are different theoretical assumptions. Or you look at cartography, some people adopt cartography, some people don't adopt cartography. These are all important models, and each one of these models has the advantages that it has explanatory value. The explanatory values are overlapping. There are some things which, let's say, take two of these models that both models explain, and then there are some things that this model explains but the other one doesn't, or that this one does and the other one doesn't. We don't have, we haven't developed within syntax the ability to choose between these, and that's due to several reasons. One is that syntax is a little bit too loose, to be perfectly honest. It needs to be a little bit tightened. There are too many ways to say things, and the difference between them is not always theoretically easy to pinpoint. Should I give an example?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay. So this example I've frequently given. So we know, for instance, and we've known for a very long time, we've known this since the 70s, since John Bresner's work, that the tense node and the complementizer are dependent on each other. So for instance, this has now been demonstrated typologically in lots of languages, but if we look at English, we know, for instance, that the complementizer that requires a tense clause to come after it, and the complementizer for does not take a tense clause after it, and so on and so forth. So we know there is a relationship, and the relationship is well established. It works. Now, in most trees that you probably saw, most trees that I saw, the way that we capture this is we say, okay, you have a CP, the CP has a C, and then you have a TP under this, and you have the T, and there's some kind of a relationship between T and C. Now, what's this relationship? For instance, it could be movement. It could be that the T moves to C. It also could be that it's agree. So the C agrees with T, but there's no movement. Even if we go more radical, we're assuming that the dependence is captured so that C is above T. Mm-hmm. But how do we actually know? How do we know that it's not that, let's say, the CP, the C is a specifier of T, or the T is a specifier of C? And the thing is, yes, I can tell you a story and it would follow from the story, but somebody else would tell you a different story. And the truth is that we are very solid on the fact that there are relationships. We know the relationship is local. I mean, it's not going to be across to another clause. And so we can characterize this very, very well. We know that happens in a lot of languages. We are very secure on stating the relationship. How present-day syntactic theory represents this relationship? Yes, there is the canonical way that we do it, but the canonical way that we do it is not inevitable. And we have the theory, in other words, is not sufficiently rigorously formalized to be able to decide between these things. Now, that is one reason why I think staying within syntax today requires some push. This is for the next 10 years. That it's a little bit too loose and that we need some formalization. Now, the syntax has avoided formalization because there was the notion, I think Noam Chomsky was the first to articulate it, and other people have repeated it since, that if we formalize syntax, it would only end up in freezing it at whatever stage of development it is, and it would make it this thing that's been very, very nice. Hi, Kat. This thing that's been very nice about syntax, and that is that it's been thriving. You know, you get lots of proposals and so on. It's a very thriving field, and if we locked it into some formalism, perhaps that would be a lot harder to accomplish. But perhaps some degree of formalism at this point would be helpful. That's one thing. The second thing is that we've come to a point where a lot of people, and me included, question the ability, they question at least some version of what used to be called the autonomy of syntax. So I think the autonomy of syntax, by way of a methodological assumption, was extremely important and extremely successful. Okay, but I think we've come to a point where, to some extent, it is what I said. I mean, you can if you're just staying within that's sometimes called narrow syntax, whatever that might be, you're moving a little bit in circles. And I think what is important to take on board is, first and foremost, the syntax semantics interface, and that has been taken on board. So if you're talking about important things in the last 20 plus years, that's the incorporation of the syntax semantics work into syntax, which has been extremely important. I think it's been extremely important. It's been extremely influential. It's been very, very good for the development of syntax, and to some extent also to the development of semantics. I'm not entirely sure, to be perfectly frank, that there is much more to go in that direction without semantics changing. Because I think one of the properties of the semantics that we've been working with is that it doesn't actually, I mean, you can build hierarchical representations into it through type theory and so on, but it's not inherently hierarchical. It does not inherently have, for instance, locality constraints. If there is something in syntax like a cycle or a phase, or however you want to call it, and that's been I mean, the question is not whether it exists or not. The question is just how to model it. It's not obvious that that's a sensible notion inherently to semantics. And also there is a very powerful, I think, within syntax direction now that is very top down. I mean, my work certainly. It goes from the structure to the interpretation and not the other way around. But semantics, as we do it, is still extremely invested in the denotations of terminals. And so the question really is looking at where syntax is going now and where semantics is at. It's possible that some changes would need to occur in semantics to make it, for it to continue to be as hugely useful and influential as it has been, because the results that exist, and I think they're extremely important. And yeah, but I think I would be probably right to say that the interface had brought about more changes in syntax than it has brought in semantics. Semantics are not doing a hugely different semantics now than they were doing 20 years ago.
Okay.
And so this, I think, is a very, very important thing that has happened. I think it's a good thing. Okay. The other thing that started happening in the last maybe 10, 15 years is that we started taking on board word structure.
I'm sorry, what?
Word structure, the internal structure of word, taking
Yeah.
it on from the perspective of syntax. I mean, word structure has been, there's lots of stuff on word structure, but taking it on board as part of the syntax.
Okay.
And that's an ongoing project, and it's very tricky. So, okay, so I think maybe time for you guys to ask me follow-up questions on all of this, because I've just talked for 10 minutes or something.
I think your answers were really great. And we are doing the same questions to a lot of people. And that thing about typology always appear that it's one of the things in different areas that I think it's related with the milestones. I think it's the first.
What? It's related with what?
The milestones in the last 20 years. Okay. I think it's the first thing that people answer. I don't know, but yeah, I think it's all. I wanted to ask you another question. You've done work on acquisition, and what would you say is the
I'm sorry,
acquisition?
I think the sign is a little deteriorated, and I have a hard time understanding what you're saying. Yeah.
That you've done work on acquisition, and yes. What would you say are the contributions of, I don't know, studies on acquisition and cognitive science in general to theoretical linguistics?
Okay, I've done work on acquisition, but somebody characterized my works relatively recently as having been a contributor to the earlier stages of language acquisition. I don't know how early it is early, but I think what they really meant, and which is correct, is that I myself never did experiments. So my work was never experimental. And I worked, I'm not an experimentalist, and so this was not what I did, but I mostly worked from corpus and from existing knowledge, stuff that was already known. And you could say that I was at the first wave of attempting to give syntactic explanations for language development in children. Okay, I think that this remains an extremely important direction, and it's still there. But the important thing is that when you look at present day studies in acquisition, a lot of them are based on experiments. But actually, even that is no longer true, because if you, I think language acquisition in general is in a bit of a crisis within generative grammar. And I can't quite evaluate why that is, but especially because I'm not an experimentalist, but I can speculate. So first of all, experiments with children is a very tricky thing. And not only that, even the best experiments only begin to scratch the surface in terms of what we can get out of children, especially at a younger age, who are uttering. I mean, when the kid says "mommy shoe," it's anybody's guess what's going on, you know, and that's the thing. So yeah, if you have this theory, then there is syntax to it, and if you have somebody else's theory, it's just two words and so on. And so, and it's way too young to do any experiments, and you also can't get. I mean, there are some very, very ingenious experimental techniques that try to do eye tracking in children and try to get attention spans and things like this, and I think you can learn a fair amount from it, but it's still quite limited. And on the other hand, things that have to do with adult processing or with anything that has to do with comprehension and so on and so forth, these are very easy to run, because you're running it on adults. You're running it on adults who are good at understanding what's expected from them. If you don't understand the result, you can actually ask them, why did you do this and not do that, and you can progress. We've also now make use of certain brainwave techniques, you know, that people have been using, fMRI and EEG, and also that big wonderful machine that they have at MIT that I can't somehow remember the name of, but you guys might remember. And there are some really important, interesting results from this, and it's sexy, you know. These are very sexy results, and people want to go with them. There's also a lot more funding in this, and so I think there is a certain allure in all these neurological studies and in all the new equipment, eye tracking, and various other machines that make processing much easier to make progress with at this particular point. And when I compare this, for instance, to 30 or 40 years ago, there was very little on processing and there was a lot on language acquisition. And now we see that it's shifted. And we also see that a lot of acquisition now is moving to second language acquisition, again, because these are adults. So the experimental setup relative to children, I think, is a bit of an issue. I mean, it was something you got over when everything was on equal footing, but there's been so much technological progress in how we can probe language for adults that it's become more interesting. And also, I think there are some really important results, but I will say, okay, something else that, you know, I will be repeating myself. Okay. The fact of the matter, and I think anybody who does neuroscience will tell you that, or just about, is that we still know very little about the brain. Okay. We have a certain kind of regional mapping of the brain. There's some more specific work that talks about correspondences between certain synaptic nodes and something or another, but it remains, I mean, people who think that understanding of language can come solely from studying the brain, I think my metaphor is, it's like you're taking apart a clock and expect to learn from it what is the nature of time. And I think that it's not going to happen. It's a tool that augments our understanding, but our understanding has to first and foremost come on the basis of scientific hypotheses about what to search for. And even within this, given how rough our mapping of the brain still is, I think it's got some ways to go. It's got some ways to go. Okay. In terms of the relationship between cognitive science and grammar in general, I think that seeking to reduce grammatical knowledge or grammatical principles to general cognitive principles, it's a noble agenda. I don't think there is a cognitive science theory out there that's anywhere near ready for this to give us an explanation. So you could say, we are pursuing the study of grammar with semantics and with phonology, which I didn't actually get to say anything about, but not because we think that we are somehow going to go to war on the fact that it's not related to any other cognitive systems, but because we don't really know enough about other cognitive systems to be able to sensibly bring them on board as the original source for where those properties of language come from. So again, I think about it mostly as a methodological thing. I mean, it's like this story about the guy who's drunk and who's looking for his key under the light, even though they lost it someplace else, and they're looking under the light because that's where there's light. And if they're going to find anything at all, that's where they're going to find it. So it is quite possible that the key is someplace else altogether, but we can only look under the light. And maybe we will reach the conclusion that there's nothing under the light, in which case what we should really do is bring light to some other areas. But we can't just say, don't study what's under the light, because by assumption, the key is someplace else. It's really, we can only, you can think about the linguistic theory that we've been developing, the generative particular agenda that has, I mean, this is something that it deserves to be said, because linguistics is getting such hard time from lots of other adjacent disciplines, that we've learned in the last 60 years or so, we've learned about language more than has been learned combined in the 5,000 years before that. And I'm saying 5,000 years because maybe 5,000 years is a bit exaggerated, 3,000 years. And that's because we do actually have a history of philological studies that are about that old. And some of them are seriously excellent. So I don't want to say that somehow nobody learned anything about language. People have learned a lot about language during these traditions. You're looking at things that come from India and Sanskrit. You're looking at things that came from the Arab world, especially, let's say, in the 8th and 9th century. And after that from Europe in the Middle Ages and during the Renaissance. And you're looking at massive amounts of, and from the Aristotelian tradition, you're looking at a massive amount of knowledge that has been gained. And you would think the humans have been looking at language for that long. It's not going to be that easy to find something new. And in some sense, descriptively speaking, we are not finding anything new. But we are finding principles that nobody had found before, because they didn't think to look at them, to look for them. So in terms of its empirical discoveries, if you're evaluating every theory in terms of how much knowledge has come to be because of it, generative grammar has been spectacularly successful. Okay, and this is, it's a bit of a pity that it doesn't get a little bit more general public recognition, but because we've somehow never managed to transcend this notion that every person you meet in the street thinks that they know what language is, and they don't grant you the expertise status to tell them that they're wrong. So, you know, that's different. So that's a bit of a pity. So it is our question with a model that's been so extremely successful, where we go next. And I personally don't think that where we go next is to say it's all cognitive, and not because it's not all cognitive, but because it's not the case that cognitive science has made, I mean, locally, yes, for instance, on vision, but vision and language, if they come from the same set of principles, it requires a little bit of work to figure out how to make the connection. So maybe there are similarities, but beyond saying some very general things, you know, everything is hierarchical. You always take two things, you put them together. It doesn't go very far. So that means that at this point, where cognitive science has made its most spectacular gains, namely vision and linguistics, these were both studied quite independently within themselves, and certainly independently of each other. Anything else within cognitive science? I don't have any way of prima facie. I mean, here's something else that humans have been worried about for 3,000 years, and on that we haven't made progress as far as I can tell, and that is what are concepts.
Yeah. And
how are concepts organized. I don't think we know more now than Aristo did, for instance. Okay.
Okay. I really liked your answer.
Okay.
I think that would be all. I don't know if you want to say something else.
Yeah, I wanted to say something else that I didn't manage to say, and that is relative to your question of what we should be doing the next 10 years. And I said, okay, follow on was the typological thing, and I think word structure is really important. And I think it's time to study more seriously the syntax phonology interface. That's been very neglected. That's been very neglected. It's neglected in principle, because if you look at the models that most people work with, phonology is out of the model. You have a line that goes through the syntax all the way to the conceptual intentional interface. And shifting this to pronunciation, linearization, whatever, just almost a coincidence. It's not something that ever impacts how we think about the syntax. I think it's an oversight. I think the formal similarities between phonological structures and syntactic structures is greater than the formal similarities between semantic structures and syntactic structures, because phonology does have a cycle, phonology does have domains, and so on and so forth. And so I think we are missing some important things, and it's time. I think we are ready.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it will be all. I don't want to steal you more time. So
yeah, that's okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you so much. We are really
thank you. Thank you. Okay. Take care, and I'm looking forward to keeping in some kind of contact.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Take care. Okay.
Sure.
Okay. Have a good day. Okay. Bye.
Bye.